Rich man sees a beggar with a baby in the rain on his way to the airport and gives her the keys to his house. But what he finds when he gets back shocks him. New York City got a lot of rain, which turned the busy streets into a sea of umbrellas and wet pavement that looked like reflections. Raindrops hit Alexander Grayson's windshield like little water explosions, but he barely noticed the storm focused. He mentally reviewed every detail of his upcoming business talk. As the CEO of one of the city's big financial companies, he could time everything just right. Emotions were a luxury that could only be enjoyed when not in the business world, where practicality was the norm. But something was about to mess up his unstoppable rhythm. At a traffic light that day, Alexander saw a figure on the corner of the path that didn't fit in with the rest of the city. It was a young woman holding a baby in her arms while huddling under the heavy rain to protect the child with her body. Her thin, shaking arms were wrapped around the baby in a desperate way, and she was wearing an old, wet coat. Alexander looked at her in the rear-view mirror while he was driving. He felt something stir inside him, a strange, disturbing feeling he wasn't used to letting in. Before diving into this story, I'd like to ask for your help. Sign up for the channel, please. We're close to meeting my dream of 1,000 subscribers, and every new member is crucial to continue bringing you stories that touch and inspire your day. Thank you for your help. The millionaire's gaze was pulled to the expression on the young woman's face. Even from a distance, he could see a mix of exhaustion and drive in her eyes. She held a small cardboard sign with uneven letters that read, "Please help, we need food and housing." For a brief moment, he remembered his own childhood, marked by scarcity and cold streets, before he built his empire, but he quickly pushed the thought aside, focused on the traffic light that was about to turn green. However, just before the car moved, Alexander felt an irresistible rush of empathy, something he'd learned to control over the years. He lowered the car window, briefly speechless. The young woman paused approaching, and he noticed she could barely hold the baby. The rain increased, heavy drops running down her face, blending with silent tears. Alexander almost naturally gestured for her to come closer and, in an impulse that even surprised himself, opened the car door. "Get in," he said, his voice strong but gentle. The woman paused, clearly suspicious, but the need to protect the baby won out. She settled into the back seat, carefully holding her child. As Alexander quickly pulled away from the curb, he adjusted the car heater, feeling the chill, and noticed how her body seemed to tremble, despite her efforts to hide it. Their eyes met briefly in the rearview mirror, and he saw deep tiredness in her features. Despite her hardships, there was a certain dignity about her, a resilient pride that stopped her from asking for more than necessary. Alexander was intrigued and, without knowing why, chose not to go straight to the airport. Instead, he drove toward his mansion, a property that rarely housed any trace of human warmth. "What's your name?" he asked, softening his tone to avoid startling her ease. She replied weakly. "And this is Lucy," she added, looking at her daughter with a faint but protective smile. Alexander nodded, not asking more. The silence between them was almost comfortable, despite the unusual scenario. The grandeur of the car, the warmth now filling it, and the brief safety offered by that unexpected act of kindness felt surreal to Grace. Alexander knew that something about Grace touched a part of his past, but he chose to ignore the discomfort, focusing instead on the practical choice he was about to make. Minutes later, the car stopped in front of Alexander's vast mansion. A modern building with glass windows and a sprawling, well-kept garden looked at the house wide-eyed, unable to believe what she was seeing. She stayed silent, not knowing what to expect, as Alexander left the car, moving to open the back door and help her out. "You can stay here until I get back," he said, giving her a silver key. Still in disbelief over his own choice, Grace held the key with trembling hands, almost unable to believe what had just happened. She was used to looks of contempt and rejection, never expecting anyone to be capable of such a sudden act of compassion, especially from a man like Alexander, whose appearance and manner suggested someone cold and detached from the struggles of the streets. "Sir, I don't know how to thank you," she murmured, her voice choked with emotion and accumulated tiredness. "No need to thank me," he answered, avoiding eye contact, slightly uncomfortable with this rare show of humanity. "Just take care of her and yourself. I'll be back tomorrow." Without waiting for more answers, Alexander turned and walked back to his car, not looking back. He knew he had a flight to catch and a meeting that could determine the future of his company. But as he drove toward the airport, a disturbing feeling continued to haunt him. He knew Grace wasn't just another homeless person he had helped. Something about her touched him deeply, though he was hesitant to admit why. Grace, for her part, entered the mansion quietly, still in shock. The warmth of the house surrounded her and she took a deep breath, inhaling the soft fragrance in the air. The luxury around her seemed a world apart, a faraway reality, and the mansion grew more imposing with every step she took. Holding Lucy close, she slowly walked through the roomy living room, where sophisticated furniture, art pieces, and a crystal chandelier made everything seem like a mirage. To Grace, this was an unplanned and almost miraculous refuge, a place where she could finally rest, if only for one night. As the night went on, Grace found a nice room where she could lay Lucy down on a soft bed, something she'd never been able to offer her daughter. Lucy's eyes sparkled upon seeing the luxury room, and Grace couldn't hold back an emotional smile for a few moments. She felt genuine happiness, seeing her daughter in a safe setting, even if she didn't know what the future held. That night, while the storm continued raging outside, Grace gave herself a moment of relief. Alexander's house was an improbable haven, but for now it was all she had and all she needed. Closing the door behind her, Grace felt years of torment and doubt lift from her shoulders, as if she'd left them outside. The pristine walls, the luxurious furniture, and the tall windows facing the dark, rain-lit garden made this place a surreal haven. In silence, as if afraid to wake from a dream, Grace let her gaze wander around the wide room, almost unable to believe what she was seeing. In her arms, Lucy slept, unaware of where she was, but snuggled in her mother's arms, as if for the first time, she felt safe. Grace knew this chance, as unlikely as it was a small miracle. For someone like her, who lived without a permanent home or stable shelter, knowing she could sleep without worry was an unthinkable luxury. Looking around, she noticed an open kitchen fully equipped with gleaming tools. Feeling a pang of hesitation, she approached, but hunger overpowered any concerns. Since she'd lost her home, the chances for a good meal were rare, and cooking with fresh ingredients even rarer. Without thinking too much, she gently laid Lucy down on one of the chairs, making sure she was still deeply asleep, and walked to the kitchen. The cabinets around her were impeccably organized, showing shelves filled with foods she hadn't seen in a long time. She opened the refrigerator drawer with eager fingers, finding fruits, veggies, and dairy products, all fresh and inviting under the white light. She took out some ingredients, hesitant as if each action might shatter the magic of the moment. She picked eggs, a few vegetables, and a slip of homemade bread, feeling a simple joy as she began to prepare a meal. As she stirred the eggs in the skillet, Grace couldn't control the swelling emotion in her chest. Cooking for most was routine, but for her it meant stability, security, and, above all, a sense of control that had long been absent. When the soft smell of the cooked eggs began to fill the kitchen, a quiet smile appeared on her face. It was a familiar yet long-forgotten feeling. She cut small pieces for Lucy, imagining her daughter's reaction to a meal made with love and care. In a few minutes, the simple but nourishing meal was ready and Grace sat at the table, her heart warm and her gaze showing relief and thanks in her tired eyes. Lucy woke up to the smell and Grace lifted her with a tenderness that overcame hunger and exhaustion. The child smiled, her eyes shining with the innocence of someone unaware of life's difficulties. Grace patiently fed her quietly, laughing at Lucy's delighted face with each bite. It was a familiar scene for many, but for Grace it was like a stolen piece of normalcy from the past. As they ate, Grace allowed herself to relax for the first time in months. Each bite brought strength back to her body and soul. The simple meal became a celebration, a moment of peace amidst the storm that was her life. After dinner, Grace turned to Lucy, who was playing with a spoon as if it were the most valuable of toys. Grace watched her with a serene look, savoring the instant of peace. She got up and walked around the house, looking for a place where she could give Lucy a warm bath and maybe take one herself. Entering the master bathroom, Grace stopped astonished by the space's grandeur. White marble walls, heated floors, and a bathtub big enough for two gleamed under the soft lights. It was a place she never thought she'd be, a symbol of a world she didn't belong to. But there, facing the chance to provide a bit of comfort for her daughter, Grace took a deep breath and decided that at least for one night she'd enjoy this comfort. She filled the tub with warm water and carefully undressed Lucy, gently lowering her into the water. Watching her daughter's face light up with surprise at the soothing warmth, the little one laughed and splashed her laughter echoing around the bathroom, changing the space into a bubble of genuine happiness. Grace washed her daughter's little fingers, her face, and wrapped her in a soft blanket she found in the closet. After taking care of Lucy, Grace finally took a bath herself. The warm water washed over her skin, taking away the traces of time and the painful memories of nights spent in the cold, closing her eyes. She was moved to a time when she still had a home and a bright future. But life, with its unpredictable turns, had pushed her far from that road, teaching her that destiny wasn't always fair. Grace stepped out of the bath, feeling refreshed, as if she'd left a part of her pain in the water flowing down the drain. She found a soft robe and wrapped herself in it, feeling hugged, almost as if in a dream. Lucy, already sleepy, rested quietly on the king-size bed pillows, a rare and precious sight that made Grace sigh with pure relief. She lay beside her daughter, holding her gently, her mind drifting between thanks and hope. With Lucy snuggled in her arms, the accumulated exhaustion of recent months washed over her in waves. Grace closed her eyes, breathing in the gentle smell of clean sheets and the warmth of the room that protected her from the storm outside. She knew this night was a rare gift and she wasn't sure what the next day would bring. But at that moment she was determined to set aside her fears and worries. For the first time in a long time, Grace let herself fall asleep without fear. It was a strange but welcome peace that engulfed her completely. The shadows of her past seemed to dissolve, even if only briefly, as she took a deep breath and sank into a deep and restorative sleep. During the night, images of her old life showed in her dreams. There was a time when she was young and full of ideas, when nothing seemed impossible. She remembered the days she was a dedicated student, trying to make a difference and build a future. But those dreams had been abruptly interrupted and she had to learn to live. Grace shifted in bed, but as she held her daughter closer, the comfort of the present enveloped her in a way that, for the first time in a long time, she didn't have nightmares. Instead, she dreamed of a life where she could offer Lucy a youth free of hardships. As the first rays of sunlight began to light up the room, Grace, slowed, woke up. Still between sleep and reality, the room stayed silent, except for the soft sound of Lucy's breathing beside her. She looked at her daughter's serene face and allowed herself a smile. That night had been more than just rest. It was proof that hope still existed in her life. Grace got up, breathing deeply, determined to do whatever it took to keep that peace in her life and her girls. When the first rays of sun entered the room, Grace's eyes opened slowly and the reality around her began to solidify the soft bed. She had rested on the blanket that warmed her, and Lucy's serene face beside her reminded her that, even if just for a moment, she had found a safe haven. But as her gaze wandered around the elegant surroundings, her thoughts started to drift back and painfully her past returned like a turbulent river of memories. Grace never thought she would one day be homeless. Years before she had been a young woman full of dreams and strength, her dreams had seemed so close, almost real. She had worked hard to get accepted into one of New York's top medical schools, overcoming difficulties and fighting tirelessly to become the first in her family to earn a college degree. She was recognized among her professors as a talented student with a love for medicine that showed in her dedication to her studies and her sincere desire to help others. Her mother used to say that, even as a kid, Grace was always caring for small animals in the neighborhood, always kind, always trying to ease any suffering. Everything seemed to be in place until the day she lost her parents in a terrible accident. Grace remembered the late-night phone call, the hollow feeling upon hearing the news, and the despair of understanding that the life she knew was ending. The world she had known crumbled in seconds, with her parents' deaths. She lost not only her family, but also the mental support that kept her grounded. The sadness consumed her and the pain, once internal and silent, turned into a weight that affected her every action, draining her spirit. Along with her parents, Grace also lost the financial support that allowed her to study without worrying about costs. Bills began piling up and the exhausting pace of medical school, mixed with the job she'd taken to try to support herself, began to take a toll on her performance. She spent sleepless nights, torn between academic responsibilities and rising hardships, and it became clear her energy was dwindling. It was during this time of weakness that she met Christopher, a charming and seemingly understanding man. Christopher was polite and engaging and seemed able to read her soul. He became a friend during difficult days, someone who made her believe she could overcome that phase and that perhaps it was still possible to smile truly. Grace joined the relationship, finding in Christopher what she thought was support and eternal love. She trusted him fully, allowing him into every detail of her life, sharing her fears, dreams, and vulnerabilities. But over time, Christopher showed a side she never could have imagined. The sweet and loving man became possessive and aggressive. Grace, who once found security in him, now felt trapped in a web of control and trickery. The The once affectionate gestures turned into cruel words and demands, and she realized too late that she had given him control of her life. Quietly, he started emptying the account she'd kept for emergencies. Secretly, he diverted small amounts, but by the time Grace discovered it was too late. All her leftover savings had disappeared. One evening, as Grace tried to address Christopher, he showed her the full extent of his selfishness and coldness. With harsh, indifferent words he laughed at her illusions, rejecting the feelings he once claimed to value. He said he'd never wanted anything but her money, enjoying watching her lean on him. Emotionally, then, as if she were nothing, he left her without a hint of guilt. That night Grace was left alone, poor, carrying in her womb the child she hadn't even had a chance to plan for. Without financial or mental support and with the burden of pregnancy, Grace found herself unable to continue her studies. She tried to find work, tried to start over somehow, but with every try she faced people's contempt and the harsh reality of not being able to support herself. New York City, once the backdrop of her dreams, had now become a battleground where each day was a fight for survival. As she caressed Lucy's face, her tear-filled eyes mirrored the pain and strength that had kept her going. Her daughter was her only treasure, for her Grace suffered cold nights, extreme exhaustion and constant insecurity. Every night spent on the streets, every threat she faced was a burden she bore quietly for Lucy's sake. Grace never let hopelessness dim her eyes. When she looked at her daughter, she always tried to smile, hiding the tears and the rising fear inside her. It was her silent promise. Her daughter wouldn't bear the weight of her pain. And now, in this mansion, safe and warm, a deep gratitude started to well up within her. The memory of everything she had been through intensified the generosity of Alexander's act. He knew nothing of her story, yet he offered a hand, not just any hand, but one of hope, a chance to breathe before facing life's difficulties again. Grace wondered how she could thank him, but found no words. How could she express such gratitude? It wasn't just the physical safety he offered. It was a reprieve from pain, a night where she and her daughter could sleep in peace. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, looking for some way to repay him, her mind filled with images of her first night in college, of happy days with her parents, of the love she once felt before. Life took such a different turn from what she had planned, and she decided right then that she wouldn't let this act of kindness fade away. Alexander had given her something no amount of money could buy, proof that kindness still existed in the world. She was determined to honor that somehow. In that moment, Grace decided she would start over, no matter how. She had faced the biggest obstacles already, and now, with Lucy in her arms and a renewed will in her heart, she knew she had to turn gratitude into action. She knew Alexander might never understand the depth of her thankfulness, but she told herself that she would do everything possible to show him that his gesture had been more than just help. He had given her a night of peace, and that peace gave her the strength to keep fighting. Alexander returned to the mansion earlier than planned, as his meeting had been postponed at the last minute. Entering his home, he felt an unusual warmth. He stopped in the hallway and heard what sounded like a soft laugh and, to his surprise, realized it was a baby's laughing. Curious, he followed the sound to the guest room corridor, where the slightly open door showed a scene he'd never expected to see in his own house. The room, bathed in afternoon light, was filled with a warm and peaceful environment. Grace, kneeling on the floor, was playing with Lucy, making a toy bear dance from side to side. The little one tried to grab the toy, laughing each time Grace moved it just out of reach. Grace's expression radiated real affection and joy, something Alexander recognized as rare in his own life. He stood there for a few seconds, silently observing, totally captivated by the simplicity and happiness that emanated from the two of them. Grace and Lucy's presence seemed to have changed the house, filling it with a warmth Alexander had never experienced before. Without realizing it, a gentle smile emerged on his face and he felt something missing in his life, a sense of coziness and humanity he'd never imagined wanting. Suddenly, Grace felt his presence and turned around, slightly surprised and embarrassed. She quickly put the bear down and held Lucy, who was still smiling, unaware of Alexander's presence. For a moment Grace seemed to pause, as if afraid of reproach for being so at ease. "No need to stop on my account," Alexander said gently, his voice surprisingly soft, almost encouraging. Grace relaxed slightly, but her eyes showed a combination of surprise and gratitude that Alexander couldn't ignore. He realized how much that simple offer of protection meant to her. There was deep sincerity in her expression, and he could see that the safety and comfort of his house meant more to her than he'd thought. "I didn't know you'd be back so soon," Grace said, her voice slightly trembling but filled with pride. Alexander took a few steps closer, looking at Lucy with interest. The child looked at him with innocent eyes, reaching out her little hand, and on instinct he extended his finger for her to hold. Lucy's touch was soft and she grasped Alexander's finger happily, making him smile in a way he hadn't expected. The simple action seemed to contain a sweetness and simplicity that touched him deeply and unexpectedly. "She's great," Alexander murmured, looking at Grace, who now smiled with pride and feeling. "Yes, she is," Grace replied, her eyes shining with a feeling that went beyond words. Holding Lucy closer, she continued in a whisper, "And I don't know how to thank you. Having a safe night, a roof after so long, it was like a dream." Alexander felt the impact of Grace's words and understood how much that night had meant to her. Each of her words made him feel a growing sense of duty, something he couldn't ignore. Grace wasn't just a stranger. He'd helped. She and Lucy had filled an invisible hole in his life. The simple scene, with laughter and genuine smiles, brought a new energy to the house and, strangely, to his heart. "Grace," Alexander said, his voice soft but full of sincerity, "there's no need to thank me. Actually, I think I need this as much as you do." Grace looked at him surprised and touched by the unexpected confession. It was unimaginable to her that a guy like Alexander, so powerful and resourceful, would admit to needing something, let alone her and her daughter. But there before her he seemed more human, even vulnerable, as if that admission were a surrender to his own feelings. And suddenly Grace realized he also carried a silent loneliness. "Even so, I'm grateful," she murmured softly, her voice filled with feeling. "This place, this chance means so much more than I can explain. After so many trials, it's more than I could ever ask for." Holding Lucy close, Grace felt relief flowing through every part of her body. Alexander's offer to let her stay as long as she needed was more than she could have ever expected. The security of knowing her daughter would have a safe place to sleep was a gift she never imagined getting. The difficulties, the cold and lonely nights and the weight of so many deprivations now felt less intense, as if simply being under this roof was enough to renew her strength. The depth of Grace's relief sparked something within Alexander. He noticed there was a delicacy to this woman, a quiet pride and determination he didn't often see. Watching Grace embrace Lucy with a mix of love and protection, he wondered how someone who had gone through so much pain could still reflect such kindness. Before leaving, he leaned down and gently touched Lucy's face, who, with curious eyes, laughed again, holding his finger like it was a toy. Alexander felt an unexpected tenderness, and in that small action something changed. He realized that somehow that touch and that laugh had sparked a spark in his heart that he couldn't explain but felt right and complete. Grace watched as Alexander left, feeling a wave of peace wash over her. His kindness wasn't just a matter of shelter. It was a kind of silent acceptance, a lifeline for both of them. Something unseen and powerful seemed to connect them. She didn't know if he felt the same, but this experience, this moment of connection, would never be forgotten. Victoria Sinclair arrived at the mansion unannounced, with determined steps and a firm look. The driver had dropped her off at the imposing entrance, and she expected to find Alla Lunder at her service, as he usually was before Grace and Lucy. Victoria was the heir to an empire rivaling Alexander, and their tumultuous relationship had always been marked by competitive and intense emotion. Victoria was ambitious, proud, and had almost unshakable confidence in her own value in Alexander's life. So when she entered uninvited, she didn't bother to announce herself, believing, as always, that he'd be pleased to see her. She walked through the main living room admiring the mansion's omnilayer luxury, and in a few steps found Alexander, who was reading some papers in his study. He greeted her with restrained surprise but couldn't hide small discomfort. Over recent months the gap between them had grown and Victoria knew something had changed. "Alexander," Victoria said with a confident smile and straight gaze, "I missed you, so I decided to drop by." Unannounced, Alexander smiled, but his gaze drifted toward the hallway almost distractedly, and Victoria quickly noted his slight shift. She knew Alexander as a man committed to business, practical and careful in his personal relationships, and always aware of keeping his private life under control. However, there was something new and undefined in his expression, something Victoria couldn't interpret. As they talked, she noticed a different presence in the house. From away, she heard a soft, childish sound from upstairs. She frowned, trying to understand what it meant. Waste no time. Victoria interrupted the talk and walked purposefully toward the sound. Alexander hesitated for a moment but chose not to stop. Her part of him knew Victoria would finally discover Grace and Lucy's presence, and he no longer felt the need to hide. Turning the corner, Victoria found Grace holding Lucy in her arms, and the initial shock on her face quickly changed to distrust and resentment. She looked Grace up and down, examining every detail, from her simple clothes to the protective way she held her daughter. Lucy looked at the stranger with curious eyes, but Grace immediately sensed the veiled hatred in Victoria's gaze. "And who might you be?" Victoria asked with a mocking, poisonous smile. Grace hesitated but answered calmly and politely, trying to ignore the increasing discomfort she felt in the face of this intimidating woman. "I'm Grace, and this is my daughter, Lucy." Victoria stifled a sarcastic laugh, examining Grace with a look that dripped disdain and judgment. She figured Alexander must be giving shelter to this woman and couldn't avoid the jealousy that began to spread in her chest. It was impossible for Victoria to accept that Alexander could care about someone who, in her eyes, was just a useless stranger. After a nervous moment, Victoria turned and went back to the study where Alexander was waiting. Her expression now was completely different, full of mistrust and jealousy. "So the young lady I found upstairs." She began mixing irony with accusation. "Is she your new guest?" Alexander stayed calm but couldn't deny the discomfort Victoria's insistence caused. He knew explaining Grace's presence to this jealous woman would be difficult, and Victoria's assessing look made it clear she assumed the worst. "Grace and her daughter are going through tough times. I offered to help," he responded, trying to keep a neutral tone, but Victoria was already consumed with jealousy. Victoria narrowed her eyes, her thoughts racing. She couldn't accept that Alexander, always so guarded and calculating, had opened his mansion's doors to a stranger. Anger and hatred dominated her, and she decided she'd do everything to get Grace out of the way. "Don't you think it's risky, Alexander, letting someone you barely know stay here? She could be trying to take advantage of your kindness." Victoria insinuated, her voice filled with suggestion. Alexander stayed quiet for a moment, but Victoria's seed of doubt began to bother him. He knew Grace was honest, but security and looks had always been crucial in his life, and Victoria, sharp words, made him question if he was being impulsive. Seeing the doubt her insinuation had planted, Victoria continued to push. "Look at her, Alexander, a stranger with a child. An easy situation to control to get what she wants. How do you know she's trustworthy?" Alexander felt the weight of Victoria's words, and while part of him resisted the idea of doubting Grace, another part couldn't ignore the consequences. He decided he needed to explain the situation and, with a sigh, went up to the room where Grace was with Lucy. Seeing him enter with a tense face, Grace felt a chill down her spine. Something had changed in Alexander's manner, and her heart raced, realizing he might be doubting her. He approached, looking at her with a gravity she hadn't seen before, disorienting her Grace. "I need to understand a bit more about your story. Is there something you need to tell me?" Grace was caught off guard, feeling quickly cornered. The words Alexander used sounded like judgment, a silent charge that struck her deeply. She took a deep breath, gathering the courage to answer, but his inquisitive gaze and the memory of Victoria's disdainful face made her feel humiliated. "I've already told you what's important," she said, her voice shaking and her heart heavy. "I never wanted to take advantage of anything." Alexander observed every detail of Grace's reaction, and part of him still resisted, thinking she could be dishonest. But Victoria had planted doubt, and he couldn't shake it. Grace saw the tension on Alexander's face, and for the first time felt that perhaps this refuge, which meant so much to her and her daughter, was just a fleeting illusion. She knew she had no way to prove her honesty, and seeing Alexander's doubt was a sharp pain that struck her pride. Feeling embarrassed and desolate, she held Lucy and, without a word, decided she wouldn't stay where she wasn't truly accepted. "I think I understand," she said, her voice strong but hiding deep pain. "Thank you for the help, Alexander, but Lucy and I have stayed long enough." Holding Lucy in her arms, she left the room without looking back. In the days following Grace and Lucy's exit, Alexander felt lost in a constant restlessness. The mansion, which had always been his fortress of tranquility, now seemed wrapped in an unsettling and silent emptiness. He wandered through the hallways, but every corner of the house reminded him of Grace's gentle presence and Lucy's innocent joy. Every sound, Every echo of his solitary steps reminded him of the contagious laughter of the little one and Grace's serene face as she cared for her. That home had been transformed by their presence, and now without them, he understood how empty it truly was. In his study, as he tried to focus on the documents waiting for his attention, flashes of the times he shared with Grace came to mind. He remembered the scene of Grace and Lucy playing in the room, the lightness with which she smiled even amidst difficulties. He remembered Lucy's gentle touch as she held his finger and the care with which Grace cradled her daughter. These simple memories now affected him deeply. Grace had filled that space with a humanity he hadn't even known he needed, and the more he thought about it, the more Alexander questioned his own response to Victoria's accusation. Doubt and regret began to build. The picture of Grace's hurt expression, her resigned silence as he confronted her with suspicion, haunted Alexander. He found himself replaying the moment she left the mansion, not even after asking for answers, as if she had accepted that her honesty would never be enough for him. The pain reflected on her face was a bitter memory. Grace hadn't tried to defend herself, and now every word of accusation he'd spoken felt even crueler. She didn't deserve his suspicion, and he felt crushed by the guilt of giving in to Victoria's words. After days of thought and growing torment, Alexander made an inevitable choice. He needed the truth, not the poisoned assumptions Victoria had placed. He hired a private investigator to discover the truth about Grace's past. If he had let Victoria cloud his view of Grace, he now needed to correct that and find out who she truly was. The days of waiting while the detective did his job felt long. Alexander tried to focus on his responsibilities, but memories of Grace and Lucy's presence kept flooding back. He remembered Grace thanking him for letting her and Lucy stay safely under his roof. He remembered how the house had seemed transformed, warmed by Lucy Lou's laughter, by the almost palpable love Grace had for her daughter. The sense of loss only grew, and Alexander wondered how he could have doubted that woman's integrity. When he finally got the report, Alexander opened it quickly. His grief and need for redemption battling within him as he read, Grace's story unfolded with a depth he had never imagined. She had been a dedicated student with a promising future until the tragedy of losing her parents. Her path had been marked by pain and abandonment, by an abusive relationship in which she had put her trust. Then came the abandonment, the solitary fight to protect Lucy amid poverty and despair. Every line of the investigation showed the strength of a woman who, despite all odds, had endured with her dignity intact. Alexander felt crushed. Grace had never been a schemer, had never wanted anything from him but a temporary haven, and he had betrayed her by believing Victoria's cold words. Guilt hit him like a blow, and he realized he had been selfish and unfair. The pride that had always led him melted away, leaving behind a bitterness hard to bear. He knew that by doubting Grace, he had lost something more valuable than any material possession. As he kept reading, a painful clarity emerged. Victoria had never been and never would be the woman he truly needed by his side. Her coldness and cruelty in manipulating situations to keep control and influence disgusted him. The love he thought he felt for Victoria now seemed like an illusion, supported by interests and appearances, and realizing this, he felt an urgent need to find Grace and Lucy to offer them a sincere apology, but also something more. He wanted Grace to know that her kindness had transformed him, that the warmth and sincerity she had brought into his life were now indispensable to him. He was determined to find them. He asked the investigator to find Grace, as he needed the chance to redeem himself. That night he couldn't sleep, his heart racing at the thought that if he didn't move soon, he might forever lose the chance to make amends with her. In his mind he revisited every moment they had shared, every smile, every gesture of love Grace had shown for Lucy. He remembered her words of thanks, the way she looked at him with respect and thankfulness. These memories drove him to fight for her forgiveness. Finally, the next day, Alexander got Grace's location. Learning where she was brought him a wave of comfort, but also a new fear. He didn't know how she would respond to seeing him again, and had no idea if she would accept his apology or wish him gone. But one thing was clear. He was willing to do whatever it took for her to understand the sincerity of his sorrow and his need to have them back in his life. Leaving for the address where Grace was staying, Alexander felt a mix of worry and hope in his heart. He knew that finding her meant more than just fixing a mistake. It was the chance to open the door to a new life, one he had never planned but now felt was what he truly needed. Reaching the address, Alexander took a deep breath, facing the weight of the choices that had led him here. He was prepared to hear her refusal, to accept that she might never want to see him again, but he also knew he couldn't let fear stop him. He knew that Grace and Lucy had become the most important part of his life, and he needed to fight for them. He knocked on the door, and within seconds it opened. Grace looked surprised, with visible caution in her gaze. For a moment Alexander felt small before her, but with a deep sigh he began. "Grace, please," he said almost in a whisper, trying to control the emotion in his voice. "I know I'm probably the last person you wanted to see, but please give me a chance. I made a bad mistake. I let doubts and fears cloud my judgment, and I was unfair." He took a deep breath, watching her face. "Since you and Lucy left, I realized how much you both mean to me. The house, my life felt empty without you." Grace listened, and Alexander saw an internal fight in her eyes. She didn't respond instantly, but he felt his words were reaching her, though she was silent. Something in the way she looked at him urged him to continue. "Grace, you gave me a new viewpoint, showed me what truly matters. I want you to know I'm not just here to apologize. I'm here to ask you to come back home with me. I want to give you and Lucy the home you deserve, a home where you can be happy and safe. I want you to stay, not as guests, but as part of my life or of our lives." Grace took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly. For so long she had been looking for a haven, a place where she could finally feel at peace. Alexander's plan was tempting, but her heart still bore the scars of abandonment, of distrust. She looked away, her gaze falling on Lucy, who was playing near the door, and began to remember everything she'd endured to get here. All the pain, the lonely nights on the streets, the cold, but also the brief moments of hope. And now, facing Alexander, she felt that life was giving her a second chance. His words, so sincere and filled with sorrow, touched her deeply. She looked at Lucy, realizing that maybe this was the chance to give her daughter something she'd never had, a true family, a place where love and security could flourish. Turning her look back to Alexander, Grace saw honesty in his eyes, and something within her calmed. She knew that forgiving him and accepting his invitation was more than an emotional choice. It was the chance at a new life, a fresh start she had never thought possible. Lucy, feeling the emotion in the air, approached Alexander, looking at him with childish curiosity. In a sweet and spontaneous move, she reached out her arms to him. "Uncle Alex, are you coming with us?" Lucy asked, her soft voice, filled with hope. Her hopeful gaze made Alexander's heart race. Kneeling down to her level, he opened his arms and hugged her, whispering moved, "Yes, my little one, I'll come with you forever." Seeing Lucy's move, Grace felt a knot unravel in her heart. It was as if her daughter's innocence was giving her permission to start again, to open her heart once more. She smiled silently, and when Alexander looked up, he found her eyes full of tenderness and silent understanding. "I accept, Alexander," Grace said, her voice heavy with emotion, "but with one condition, that what we build is real, without fears or mistrust." He nodded with tears quietly in his eyes. "I promise, Grace, I swear, we'll build together, and nothing and no one will take that away from us." As he embraced her, Alexander felt the confidence that he was starting a new chapter in his life. In that moment he realized the love and trust growing between them were much stronger than any question or fear. When they finally returned to the house together, the cold formal environment seemed transformed. Lucy's laughter filled every corner, and Grace's gaze, now bright and serene, was the true mirror of the peace and happiness he had been seeking. Victoria, upon hearing of their reconciliation, felt the bitter truth of her defeat. She hadn't just lost Alexander to another woman, but to a family he had decided to build with sincerity and love. Defeated and embarrassed, Victoria left knowing she would never hold the place in his heart she once thought she owned over time. Alexander offered Grace a position in his company where she could dedicate herself and grow professionally, knowing he would back her at every step. Together they gradually built a genuine life where trust and respect were the basis. For Lucy, Alexander became more than just a regular presence. He became the father figure she so badly needed. In his care for the little one, he found the meaning he had been seeking. One sunny day, while they were playing in the garden, Lucy called him Dad for the first time, and Alexander felt it was the greatest title he had ever gotten. Every day was a step toward a new life, a life where everyone had the chance to be happy, to feel complete and safe. Alexander, Grace and Lucy finally formed the family they all needed, a family where love and hope blossomed anew each morning. And so, surrounded by the joy and warmth of a life full of purpose and love, Alexander, Grace and Lucy went on together, building a future filled with hope, where the past was just a faraway memory and the present a promise they renewed every day. Did you enjoy this heartwarming story full of turns and emotions? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. Let us know what you thought of this emotional finish. See you in the next story.